When it comes to specific things that I would like to do, I want to propose a temporary 2-year tax holiday on the capital gains tax so that businesses have immediate capital that they need to reinvest. I'm proposing that we let all of the tax cuts be extended so that none of the tax increases happen on any sector of our society. Number 3, what I want to do to immediately create jobs is permanently eliminate the death tax. That's going to be reinstated on January 1st, and we don't need it. It's going to, you look like you have a question.
I'm sorry, Peter, I do want to cut in. I understand you're talking about what you want to do, but I don't think you're answering my question of what have you done specifically.
All right, well, look at the fact that I'm up here in the first place. It is my leadership that has taken on my party's leadership. My candidacy has inspired a groundswell of grassroots support that extends across partisan lines. We had an event last night where the majority of the people in the audience were indeed Democrats who said, I just cannot, in this economy with good conscience, vote for our county executive. So if you look at the success of my campaign, leadership is not determined in if you ever fall, but whether or not you get up. I'm someone who knows how hard it is
That's
to
time,
earn
Ms. O'Donnell. I'm
buck.
sorry. We can again elaborate further. Do we direct the same question to Mr. Coons?
I could do a different question for Mr. Coons, or if
Go
you
right
want to
ahead.
stay on the same topic.
Go right ahead.
Ms. Edwards, I do think I have a long and substantive record of leadership in the public sector, and I appreciate the question. I'm happy to move on to another question, though.
Okay, let's go on to your divinity degree from Yale was raised at one point. Let's talk about that a little bit because you talked about the separation of church and state, but where do you see the appropriate role of faith-based organizations in government?
60 seconds.
I do think that faith-based organizations provide broad, critical, effective, innovative relief to human suffering and to human needs. But I think we need to draw a careful line. Anytime a faith-based organization is involved in proselytizing, in outreach, in the teaching of religious doctrine, they should not be doing that with federal dollars. And frankly, on behalf of faith-related organizations with which I've served and volunteered, they have to choose very carefully how close to get to public dollars, because with public dollars comes public scrutiny, comes public accountability, and an entanglement that I don't think is appropriate. So, for example, when I was a student intern pastor with the Downtown Cooperative Ministry in New Haven, we were providing food and help and support to the homeless in New Haven, which is one of the poorest cities in New England. We didn't accept public funds at that time, and I think for a faith-based organization to accept public funds is the beginning of a difficult entanglement. I do think it is appropriate, and there are times and places when we can use public dollars to support the provision of public relief, public benefits, public services through faith-based organizations. But you have to carefully police that line and make sure they're not using those resources for proselytizing or for teaching of religious doctrine.
Ms. O'Donnell, would you like 60 seconds to add anything to that?
I think that nonprofit organizations and NGOs play a great role in our society. The people who serve in the nonprofit organizations are the ones who are committed to a cause greater than themselves. For nearly 20 years, I have worked as an advocate consulting for many nonprofit organizations. And I would also agree that we need to be careful about giving federal dollars to organizations. However, there is a role that certain nonprofit organizations can play, and I think that there's a misnomer that he spoke of, that all nonprofit organizations are faith-based. Faith plays a very important role in our society, yet we cannot dictate what faith anybody has, and our Constitution does protect that.
Anything further, Mr. Coons?
I'll simply say that those who are listening today know I did not just say that all nonprofits are faith-based. One of the challenges I think we face is to keep in this dialogue and this debate moving forward in a positive and constructive way. And so I'm not going to simply devolve into a agree-disagree. I have long experience serving with many nonprofits, with the Coalition for the Homeless, with the Ivy Dream Foundation, with the South African Council of Churches, with the Downtown Cooperative Ministry I mentioned. Two of them were explicitly rooted in a shared faith. Two of them were not. And I think lots and lots of great services in our community are provided by nonprofit organizations, both those that are rooted in a religious faith and those that are not, that are non-sectarian.
Can I ask you a question, Chris? Can you name the 5 freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment?
I think the very first provision of the First Amendment is that the government shall make no establishment of religion. And before we get into a further debate, about exactly which of us knows the Constitution better. How
No, I'm
about
just
we-
asking, can
how
you
about
name
we
the
get
5 freedoms guaranteed
How
in the
about we
First
get the
Amendment?
panel asking our questions today?
I guess you can't.
All right, 8:32 here on 1150 a.m. WDEL, live from Widener University School of Law this morning as we hold a debate between the candidates for U.S. Senate in Delaware, Christine O'Donnell and Democrat Chris Coons. Our panelists this morning, Mark Nardone from Delaware Today, Tamala Edwards from ABC 6 Action News, Alan Ludell from WDEL, and Chad Livengood from the News Journal. And the next question goes to Alan Ludell.
Peter, who responds first to the next question? That will determine which question I ask. Ms. O'Donnell or Mr. Coons? You know?
That's a great question.
Okay. Well,
Hard to believe, but I've lost track.
all right. Well, how about if Ms. O'Donnell gets the first whack at this? U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said publicly last month that the U.S. Constitution does not, in fact, bar sex discrimination, that the 14th Amendment does not necessarily apply. Considering that Justice Scalia is presumably the sort of justice that Christine O'Donnell would favor, were he up, and Mr. Coons would oppose, in retrospect, would it be against the spirit of constitutional originalism for Christine O'Donnell to have filed her gender discrimination wrongful termination lawsuit against your former employer, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute?
All right, 60 seconds, Ms. O'Donnell.
Well, my case never made it to the Supreme Court, so I don't know how Justice Scalia would rule on that. I'd need to read his remarks, but I absolutely do think that gender is one of the discriminations that we are protected against, and I support women's rights, and I'm opposed to any kind of gender discrimination.
So if I can interrupt, you're to the left of Justice Scalia on that then, huh?
Well, I'd have to read his remarks, but yeah. I mean, I'm not, unlike my opponent, I'm not someone who rubber stamps the conservative agenda. And I've gotten flack for that. I got a lot of flack from Republicans for saying that I admire Hillary Clinton. But I do. I admire any woman who holds her own in a male-dominated environment, and any woman who has paved the way. I consider myself a feminist. Ist means one who celebrates, and I celebrate my femininity. I think that the differences between men and women are a beautiful thing, and we can enter into, whether it's politics or the business world, without having to become like a man, but use our gifts in a unique way that only a woman can.
Mr. Coons, 60 seconds to you.
Could you reframe the question, Alan, so it's relevant?
Well, again, Antonin Scalia, who of course is probably, along with Clarence Thomas, one of the originalists in their thinking, says that the U.S. Constitution does not, in fact, bar sex discrimination. 14th Amendment does not necessarily apply. Talk about, I guess, for you, in terms of if you're questioning a Supreme Court nominee and had a Republican president, how you would go about trying to ascertain a would-be justice's views on that.
Well, there's a whole long line of decisions by the Supreme Court, now well settled, that interpret and that both use the 14th Amendment to apply to the state's interpretations of individual liberties, and that then interpret things like the Civil Rights Act, Title VII in particular. I am someone, as I've said repeatedly in this campaign, who believes that we can and should make more progress, for example, by repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, in ensuring that the civil liberties, civil rights, the opportunities for individuals in our country to express themselves fully are protected by our courts, and are not unduly restrained by practices or policies. I would ask questions of a potential justice, of a potential senator, about which decisions they agree with, which they would disagree with, how they would have reached that decision, and sort of what values and what personal experiences they would bring to the bench. At the end of the day, I think the future of our Constitution and our constitutional order hangs in the balance. We have a very closely divided court. Most of the major decisions of the last 20 years have been made by one justice. And I think it's important for us to continue to ensure that we have Supreme Court justices who will uphold the commitment to individual liberty that's enshrined in a lot of the law following Title VII.
Would you like to add anything further, Ms. O'Donnell, or shall we move on to another question?
We can move on.
Chad Livengood from the News Journal. It is your floor, sir.
Mr. Coons, in a television ad, Ms. O'Donnell says, quote, "I didn't inherit millions like my opponent." Will you please address what inheritance you have occurred as a member of the Gore family?
Great question, Chad. I was very surprised that my opponent chose to attack my family and me for being very successful business people. My stepfather started a business in the basement of his home with his parents, and along with hundreds of other hardworking, innovative Delawareans. Over decades, our family business, the business that's owned by everybody who works there, and many members of my extended family, has become an incredibly successful and competitive business. It's rooted in Newark, Delaware, and it's rooted in the creativity and the innovation of dozens, now today thousands, of folks from Delaware, from Maryland, from across this country and around the world, who bring their skills, their freedom, their individual talent to bear to make the Gore Company very successful. I worked there for 8 years. One of the best things about the Gore Company is that everybody who works there, everybody of whatever role, whatever place within the company, earns stock in the company, and the company is owned overwhelmingly by the folks who work there. So I was stunned that a Republican candidate would make that sort of, in my view, snide personal attack on a family that has been extremely successful in business.
All right,
in my
that's
view,
time.
it is exactly the hope that other families can be successful. That is our plan.
Let's
You
do
must
this.
be very sensitive about the fact that you stand to make a lot of money from cap and trade to think me simply saying I didn't make millions is a snide remark. Simply, that's an indictment on my financial status, because you have started to run ads that specifically name my mother. I mean, so talk about snide, talk about bringing family, and I simply said, I didn't inherit millions like my opponent. You
Ms.
brought
O'Donnell,
my
it is
mother
exactly that
into.
difference between earning
Wait, don't
and inheriting that
I
is-
don't I have a
Yes, you have.
minute
You go right ahead.
uninterrupted? Thank
Go right
you.
ahead.
Your campaign ads drag my mother into it because for 7 months we paid her as our bookkeeper $3,000. I don't think that there is anything wrong with that other than we paid her too little to work as our bookkeeper. Now, you stated that the people invested in Gore do get shares, so you are then admitting that you personally stand to make a lot of money from the passage of cap and trade, as you did other environmental policies that your company lobbied for. Your company also got nearly $1 million in stimulus funds. So because of that, if elected, would you recuse yourself from voting on cap and trade? Would you recuse yourself from voting on more stimulus funds that raise our taxes, that hurt those of us who did not inherit millions of
Okay, that's
dollars,
time.
but give your company business?
Our chance now to dialogues further on this. I'm guessing, Mr. Coons, you'd like to respond to that?
What matters to the people of Delaware is which of us as a senator has the experience, the grounding, the ideas, and the understanding to move this economy forward. And I think the 8 years that I worked hard at Gore, and I think the experience and values that I learned there, makes me, of the two of us, qualified to make the hard decisions that stand in front of us. As anyone who has served both in the private sector and the public sector knows, it is appropriate for folks to pass legislation that is broadly positive for the broad economy. Let me give you an example so we can help get to a fact pattern that perhaps
If you notice, he never
other folks can
addresses the
understand.
question. He never answers.
The answer is no.
Okay.
I would not recuse myself from voting for training dollars that would help folks all across Delaware and the country be better trained for the new economy.
The question
If
was
I
cap and
did,
trade.
Ms. O'Donnell, can you
The
point to
question
any
was-
specific, you have in debates and on your website given 3 different
Yeah.
competing examples. Each time we debate, it's a different technology, it's a different example.
Well, you
and it is
stand, there's
hard
an
for me to
article
keep
that,
track